So feel free. Ooh, recording has started. That's amazing. So I'll give it a couple more seconds to people that can't scan this QR code if they wanted to follow on their own. We'll give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So today we're going to be talking about an intro to Web3 application architecture, or dApp architecture. This is a very basic understanding of Web3 architecture when building apps. Sometimes we refer to them as dApps, not dApps, although I have heard that pronunciation before. dApps is standing for decentralized applications. This is very, very basic to kind of go over high level. We won't be doing as much code, but I'm happy to kind of go through examples as well if you guys have specific questions. Like I mentioned before, if you're just coming in, if you have questions, definitely put them in the chat. I'll try to dedicate some time near the end to answer questions. And feel free to, let me know that I'm not alone with +1s, obviously. And I'll go into the rest of our presentation. So first, who am I? Who is this guy who's talking to you on this camera on the internet? Who is this person? So my name is Manny, or Coding with Manny. I am a developer relations engineer for Polygon, specifically responsible for developer relations within the European region. So sometimes I do make trips to the MENA region, or Africa region as well, to be able to kind of do talks, as well as be able to do workshops, tutorials. My goal is really to empower people to be able to, from people from Web 2 or to Web 3, to kind of get more familiar with the technology, start building startups, building anything they want to, and kind of empower them to be able to do so. So if you're not familiar with me, please follow me on Twitter. That's usually where I'm more active. I am on Instagram, on a few others like social media platforms. I'm on GitHub, I'm on Stack Overflow. Just small background into myself. I have been in the tech industry for probably 14 years. I used to be also a tech lead, and this is probably my second job in the Web3 space, where I have also led teams, I've built teams, I've set up strategies with teams. So I'm very familiar with also that aspect of it. So you guys have questions more specifically about, hey, how do I deal with a specific issue in terms of, hey, building a team, or who's the right fit for my company, etc. Happy to answer that, hopefully in this Q&A. But also, if you have more questions, feel free to @me on Twitter, and we can start an open dialogue, and we have other people that participate as well. So going through, let's first start out. What is what in terms of Web 2 and Web 3? So we have to have a distinction. So the best way that I look at being able to distinguish two things is actually to compare and contrast them, to say, hey, what makes up Web 2? What makes up Web 3? What are the main differences between those things, to be able to understand it from a high level point of view and say, hey, I'm able to understand this better, or where can I take this in terms of building out my Web3 application in that sense too? So that said, let's dive into what makes Web 2 specifically, or what naturally makes Web 2 as a base. So first thing that you'll probably know about Web 2 is there's a data layer, or a data aspect to Web 2 that you guys should, or most people are familiar with in that sense when you're building out web applications, Web 2 applications. Usually the data is in the form of either a database, so that could be Postgres, MySQL, or a NoSQL database like Mongo. And you might see that on other services like AWS or GCP, so Google Cloud Platform, or Microsoft Azure, or different other hosted solutions for databases, or for that matter, locally as a database that you want to store specific data, right? And then the other aspect of data that we might look at in Web 2 is like the hosting. So that might be the actual web pages, that might be the large files, that might be video for that matter. There might be, a lot of different types of data that make up a web application from this. And again, I'm saying these as 3 sections, or 3 main categories to kind of make up a web application, but obviously there's a lot of different minute parts to it. But from a high level point of view, I'd like to categorize and these 3 sections that I'm going to let you guys, I'm going to explain a bit further. So the second aspect is like networking. So now that we have, hosted information, our images, our video, or even for our database, what we probably want to expose it in some way to the web and get people to interact with it. And one of those ways is usually with like TCP, so like an IP address or DNS. And sometimes you can do FTP and some other protocols to be able to kind of access that data. So at the same time you go to, google.com or S3 bucket, so and so, you'll be able to kind of really be able to kind of access that data from a public point of view. So from a base, we have data. Second, we have network that gives us access. And the last portion of it, which is like the client. So the way the means of being able to access the data through the network or whatnot. So the network is there, but we need something to be able to actually fetch the data or interact with that network. And the clients are your browser, your mobile phone. They might be a client in terms of an actual server. Clients can mean a few different things, but typically a client might be a browser, mobile phone, or again, a separate server that's connecting through TCP or through some sort of DNS or some sort of networking that accesses that data, or through via database, like getting some data from a database or getting some data as an image or a video through hosting or a web page for that matter. So that's typically what we see in terms of web applications. You might have some varying pieces to it as well that are, like, oh, I have some custom server that's doing some compute power to do it. But in general, as a general sense, we have this. This is usually what makes up a Web2 application. Right. So now that we have this basic understanding, so we have this base of Web2, let's kind of compare what those three themes are on the Web3 aspect of things. So just before that, we just want to give some examples of those Web2 application examples, which are like a database might be Postgres, hosting might be like Netlify or AWS S3, and TCP or DNS might be, GoDaddy with AWS or et cetera. There's a few other services that you can do. So like name registrars that register a domain that point to an IP address. And then there's like obviously your clients like Chrome or iOS for that matter. So that these, just to give you some examples of what that looks like in terms of the Web2 space. Now, Web3. So in the Web3 side of things, data is significantly different compared to what we normally see on Web2. So data and the data layer is really the blockchain, right? So the technology that we use to be able to store the data. But the difference here that most blockchains, most people don't realize, is that blockchains actually, they're made in a way, every block in that blockchain is usually really a small piece of data. It's not meant to store huge portions of data. You could store, and it's probably possible, but a lot of people probably didn't try to do it, is that you could store a video or an image on it. But the thing is, for blockchains, when you want to store those, it actually costs a lot of money to store that large piece of data on the blockchain. So typically, there has actually been other solutions that have been invented or to kind of resolve this, which is IPFS. It's a specific protocol for a file system. ARWeave is another. Filecoin is another as well. But they are specific ways to be able to store large pieces of data on a decentralized way, so that you can access it, and it actually is permanent. And this is the thing that's different between the data layer, between Web2, is that on the data side of things, everything here is like, you can almost think of it as permanent. There's a traceable way to be able to kind of find that information or be able to access it again. Networking is a little bit different in the sense that it's not like necessarily a protocol like HTTP or TCP, or for that matter, like an IP address with DNS. The networks are, hey, this is I'm using Ethereum as an example. There's a mainnet, so the main network that is used for Ethereum, and then there's also a testnet, which is also known as Gurley. There's a few other testnets, but they're used as a networking means to be able to say, hey, if you want to interact with the blockchain, this is the network that you would use to interact with that specific blockchain. And there's actually quite a few different types of chains, what we call chains, that exist. Everything from AVAX to Solana to for that matter. Am I the only one having difficulty hearing him? Can you guys give me a +2 if you can hear me just fine, or if my audio is good? It's good. Yes. All right. I got a yes. So I'm going to assume that applies to everybody. Awesome. So in general, like the idea is that your networking will actually decide which chain you're actually going to go to. And there's a few. There's Polygon that has one. There's AVAX. There's Polygon in the sense is like Matic, and there's a few other networks that kind of exist that will let you gain access to a specific blockchain or interact with that blockchain. Now, client is where this actually differs, right? In the sense that a client in this case isn't your browser or your phone or a specific server. there's two ways typically that you kind of, a client is to be able to interact with the blockchain, just like a client was used to interact with a web application in a specific way, or interact with the actual data. A client is used to be able to do that. And there's two ways, right? The non-standard way that most people don't people don't actually do is you can actually build your own node. So you could run your own node, and usually the Ethereum Foundation really advocates for this, because it's like, hey, you're not like introducing another person in the middle to be able to interact with the blockchain. It's like you are directly connected. This is the network you're on, and you can do reads and writes to the blockchain. And this is probably the most direct and efficient way for them as they see it. The issue is like setting up a node is actually kind of complicated, right? So there's a lot of steps to it. But I do recommend, if you have the time, go through the Ethereum Foundation or ethereum.org website, and they'll actually go through the steps to be able to set up a node for you. It is a little bit of DevOps work in terms of architecture, but I definitely recommend, if you do have the time and you want to actually like look into this, ethereum.org is a great resource for it. The other way to be able to interact with the blockchain is called an RPC. So this is called a remote procedural call. What this does is like almost think of it as a cloud solution for that node. So an RPC in this case are services that exist that make it a lot easier for you to interact direct with that blockchain, doing reads and writes, right? And those remote procedural calls is just a way to say, hey, I've abstracted the idea of you setting up a node and trying to interact with it, and I'm just made like a simple API layer that you can just send us commands and payloads and data in that sense to us, and then we'll redirect that and make the command for you on the blockchain. So almost like a proxy in that sense, or a person in the middle to be able to make those transactions, right? And this is where a little bit in terms of things differ. So to recap, the data aspect is really blockchains, IPFS, or like permanent storage. Networking is like the actual networks that relate to those blockchains. And the clients are nodes or an RPC to be able to interact with the blockchain. Whereas we had them on Web2, which were, browsers, iPhones for that, or iOS for that matter, or Android that might interact with the Web2 application. So just to give some quick examples of Web3 solutions for this, what this actually looks like is, for our blockchain, we can say Ethereum, or you could say Polygon. For your IPFS storage, you might see something like Filebase, Arweave, Filecoin. Just as a few solutions that exist. And then for your networking, mainnet, that's Ethereum. Gurley is a testnet for Ethereum. Polygon mainnet, which is for Polygon. Mumbai testnet is for Polygon as well. And there's a few other chains that have their own mainnet and also their testnets that allow you to be able to kind of access the blockchain in that sense. And an example as a client is an EVM node. So this is called an Ethereum virtual machine node. And that node would allow you to connect directly to the blockchain and interact with it directly. Again, it's a little bit of a few steps to actually get this working. But if you want to use an RPC, which typically if you want to get up and running and start building decentralized apps or dApps, you might use a service like Alchemy, Infura, Anchor as a way to be able to kind of, hey, I don't want to set up my node. I just want an easy way, give me an endpoint and let me interact with the blockchain and do read and writes too. And those are a few examples that you can use to kind of take away from Web3, like Web3 examples in that sense. But so let's do a diff in this sense. Like what's the major difference, right? And we'll see that, the data layer kind of exists. We have our networking that exists. Where we do differ is that there's a Web3 client in the middle that requires us to be able to interact with the blockchain, right? And then we actually have one more step that is a difference between Web2 applications and Web3 applications, is the idea of a wallet and a currency, which is native. So the idea of a wallet usually actually uses, if you look at one of the examples is like MetaMask, it actually uses RPCs to be able to interact with the blockchain. And the currency aspect of it, what's nice is that if you really think about it, blockchain allows for a native currency that exists. And what I mean by that is like, typically, when you try to pay for something with a Web2 application, you're actually going through a proxy or a different service in that sense to be able to pay for something. Like if you're using PayPal or Stripe or whichever service that you're using to be able to make that payment, you're bound by that third party's rules and in terms of the laws that dictate them as well. So in order to be able to transfer money or pay for something, it's not done in a decentralized way, or it's not done something that's native to your platform. And this is where blockchain really does something really interesting in the sense that it gives you the opportunity with an actual cryptocurrency or a token that's native to it that allows you to do exchanges for transactions, etc., for read and writes. So this is a little bit different when it comes to differing between Web 2 and Web 3. And the last aspect, is, if we look at it, is the Web 2 client. So Web 2 client is still there, but the way that the Web 2 client interacts with the blockchain is you have your browser. In this case, it's like Chrome, you know, it interacts with a wallet, your MetaMask, that goes through an RPC. In a sense, depending on how your wallet's configured, it'll tell the RPC, I want to point to mainnet or testnet as a network for, let's say, Ethereum mainnet, and then it'll make a read or a write interaction to the blockchain based off your wallet. And also it, depending on the transaction, if it's a write transaction, most of the time it'll actually ask for a piece of currency. In this case, it's Ethereum, to kind of to incentivize the transaction to make sure that it goes through. So these are the major pieces where ID and payment kind of come into play, as well as a Web3 client. The networking and the data side, that's not new. Like that has existed. The only difference is probably how that data is stored. But from a Web2 application point of view, everything else is the same. We're doing it through an API, except for like that wallet and the currency side of things, if you're dealing with the front end, or if, for that matter, in terms of a back end. So what are these benefits? Like, okay, great. You know, you just came through, you kind of give me the differences between these Web 2 and Web 3, but like, what are the main advantages that you can kind of see with Web 3? And one of the main ones is decentralized. And what I mean by that is that it's not bound by a centralized service that dictates if your site is going to go down. Imagine, you know, you store something on AWS S3 or another service and you forgot to pay it, or Amazon changes their rules and they're like, hey, actually, we're getting rid of a whole bunch of, there's nobody that's dictating that for you except for yourself in terms of what's written on the blockchain. So in this sense, it's almost trustless. There's no intermediary. There's no person in the middle to be able to kind of dictate how that data is kind of being stored. So decentralization, huge plus in the sense is that, hey, we're interacting with the network directly, right? Immutable is the idea that it's the inability of a block to be deleted or modified once the block is kind of created. So imagine if you have a database and you could only read and write, okay, but not update and delete, right? So if you can think of it almost like, if you're familiar with CRUD, like create, read, update, and delete for APIs, imagine it that, and you can only perform create and reads. So in this case, what immutable does is like, you're able to kind of say, hey, I'm not going to modify the original state. I'm just going to add on top of it another state and another state, so we can actually see the history of that. You can kind of think of it, the best example I can kind of think for this is a little bit like Twitter. It's like, imagine Twitter itself, and you can only do tweets, but you can't modify the original tweet, so you only have to create a new tweet. The only difference is with the blockchain is that you can't do deletes. All you can do is creates in that sense. So it's a little bit more permanent. What that does, though, what immutability does, is creates this idea with decentralization, is like this idea of scarcity. So if you can only create things once in a particular way, it creates this idea that only certain aspects of digital assets or whatnot, or digital items, could be only created once, and there's ways to be able to kind of, you know, interact with them and create this idea that, you know, something could potentially be owned. A third aspect of it is like verifiability. Okay, in this sense, it's like what immutability shows is that we can see the history of different blocks, like history of specific data that goes into the blockchain. And the nice thing about it for most blockchains is that that data is accessible. So, hey, somebody just sent me 10 Ether. If they did send me 10 Ether, that would be great, because that's a lot of money. But what that essentially is, anybody can see that on the blockchain, who made the transaction from person A to person B, and everybody's able to verify that information and see what that transaction is online. And a great example of this is, if you're familiar, is Etherscan. If you go to etherscan.com or .io, I can't figure out what the extension is, but the idea is you can go there and you can actually see blockchain transactions based off that too. The other aspect of it is native payments, like I mentioned before, and this is the major benefit, one of the major benefits that blockchain comes in. Not only do you create like immutable, decentralized data, you know, you have a form to be able to incentivize transactions to make sure that, hey, if I'm going to perform a transaction, I really need to know, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is in terms of saying I'm going to really pay for this transaction to go through so that I can incentivize and that data is constantly stored in that sense. So it kind of like supports this ecosystem for nodes to exist and people to kind of, and for that matter, validators to kind of continue on with the blockchain, but it also creates this idea of an economy that really in itself doesn't require an intermediary, apart from an idea of an exchange to kind of switch your regular local currency to cryptocurrency, but it's native within the platform. Once it's in there, you're not required to get approval from anybody in that sense. And this is what true native payments, where blockchain really kind of comes in when it comes to Web3. And it's a big aspect. Most people overlook this, but it's something that really has changed how we deal with the internet and how we deal with applications in general. All right, so how do I build? And you might see this like thing, Biddle. There's this whole like, I really recommend, there's this tool called Glossetta, which gives you all these Web3 jargons that exist. One of them is like HODL, as in hold, and the other one is Biddle. It's been going around as the idea of just like flipping the last letters. So, but the idea is like, what is like the stack of like building on a Web3 application? And we'll go over some of the features step by step, but one of the main ones that you need to be able to work with Web3 is that you need to understand a user's wallet. And the wallet examples might be MetaMask, Coinbase, or Phantom for that matter, which is a little bit more in Solana. But the other ones are Ethereum, Solana, Ethereum, Polygon, and other EVM type chains, or EVM or Ethereum virtual machine compatible blockchains. So these are wallets that accept those currencies like USDC or Ethereum or other custom tokens to be able to process transactions. The next thing are RPCs. So like I mentioned before, RPCs, which stands for remote procedural calls, is a way for you to interact with the blockchain. And actually, for most of these services, most of these wallets, under the hood for the configurations, they're actually using an RPC to be able to interact with the blockchain. So using almost like a semi-proxy for you to be able to process the transaction, say, hey, I'm confirming I'm doing this transaction, I'm sending this money to process something, and it'll go through one of these services. So they're an easier way, a more scalable way to be able to handle processing transactions on the blockchains. The next thing is like the actual blockchain data, which your RPC node interacts with. That might be Ethereum, Polygon, Solana, and there's a few other chains that exist, obviously, AVAX to name another one. But this is like how you're building. And what it usually ends up doing is you'll actually make applications and in the form of code called Solidity for a lot of these EVM chains, or Rust for Solana, to actually get deployed to this specific blockchain. And that's great for like small pieces of data, like I mentioned before. So what if you wanted to build an application that stores like large pieces of data in a sense too? Well, that's where Arweave, IPFS, and Filecoin come into play. And these are great ways to be able to do permanent storage or semi-permanent storage, so that you can kind of handle those large pieces of large files to be able to kind of give people access to. And usually they have also native connections with your wallet to be able to kind of verify certain things. And you can, depending on the application you want to build, you could create gates or learning applications where you're like, hey, I'm creating a video that's like stored on one of these large file storage systems. And what's great is that you can create, based on somebody's wallet, you can say, oh, this particular wallet address only has access to it, or a wallet address that only has a certain amount of ether is allowed to have access to these large files. So there's things that you can do in that sense too. And the last aspect is, okay, well, you have your wallets, your RPC nodes, your blockchains, your large. You need a way to be able to build these applications. And some of the tools that exist today are Hardhat, which is great in terms of you're doing it natively in JavaScript, and some Solidity work in terms of the programming language that's used for building out blockchain contracts, so the programming language that are needed to build applications on those blockchains. Foundry is actually a new one that kind of came out recently, which is also native, all in Solidity, so there's no JavaScript in it, which is also blazing fast solution or tool that can be used to build contracts. And Anchor, again, I'm not too familiar, not to be confused with Anchor, the RPC provider, but this is more on the Solana side of things to be able to kind of build out applications specifically for Solana as a chain itself, right? So these are all the solutions, right? So where do I go from here? I have understanding of wallets, RPCs, blockchain, large storage tools, or whatnot. So I'm going to give you guys some learning resources to kind of start off. If you're really new to this, whatnot, and some of this made sense, some of this didn't make sense. If you're coming from a point of view, you're Web2 and you want to dive in a bit deeper, you're like, great, Manny, you gave me a tip of the iceberg, and this really is a tip of the iceberg in terms of data. Where do I go from here? So there's a few resources I would recommend, and this is personally I've gone through some of them myself, just to be able to understand, how people are teaching, what are the metaphors they're using to be able to better understand things. One of them is BuildSpace, or buildspace.so. They have a great community as well that they exist as a site that lets you go through different tutorials at your own pace, and they also have office hours every once in a while to be able to kind of help you go through building out different applications, right? And Code Club is really more hands-on in this sense. It's a workshop or a cohort in that sense that you have to actually apply, and they have a really good, like a beginner's boot camp that I recommend that you sign up for as well. And they actually have a teacher that goes through with you over a span of 4 or 5 weeks, sometimes for the beginner one, and then for the expert one, it actually goes over 5 weeks, and it's actually a little bit more intense. But they do a really comprehensive job of more hand holding in terms of really being there to go through the workshop with you, and it's completely free. All you need to do is apply. Another one, and I'm going to be a little bit partial to this, is I'm actually a member of Developer DAO. And DAOs are really interesting because they're decentralized autonomous organizations, which allow you to be part of a group of like a community essentially that's built on top of the blockchain, which is really cool. And one of the products that kind of came out of Developer DAO, which is Developer DAO Academy. So if you go to academy.developerdao.com, you'll actually see a walkthrough of getting familiar with building out some like rudimentary and semi-advanced decentralized applications you can kind of build, and it's really like robust in terms of understanding it from basics. If you're the type of person like, hey, I just want to go on my own pace, this is a good place to go. Web3 University, I know a lot of the guys also from Alchemy that are DevRels that are on this side of things. They do a great job of handling the courses. They have like specific boot camps that they go through. So definitely check out Web3 University. And the last one is Crypto Zombies. It's more of an at your pace aspect of it. It's really funny in the sense that they incorporate metaphors of zombies with it, and learning in that sense of how to build blockchain contracts and applications. These are really some great resources that you guys can kind of go from there. And one of the greatest resources of all is really also hitting me up on Twitter. You can just at me publicly, and I can try to do my best to find the best resource for you. And I also do other talks as well, so feel free to hit me up. I have a ton of other presentations and resources so that I can definitely throw your way. So if you did enjoy this talk, if you get like a primer of like the differences between Web2 applications and Web3 applications, this is a great base to kind of go from here and say, hey, I understand some basic concepts, and you can definitely go over this presentation a few more times to kind of reiterate, hey, how do I understand this? What was that word he used, etc. Kind of to kind of get better clarity. But I will open the floor to questions if anybody has questions. By the way, +3 for this amazing presentation that I did, obviously. Love that I did a +3 for myself. You feel free to unmute yourself if you guys have a question, to a raise hand, or if you're feeling a little timid or shy, you can definitely type up your question. Feel free to ask anything. And anything is there's no dumb questions here. Like I early on remember that I've been in tech for a while. I've asked a lot of dumb questions in my sure, my Twitter handle, I'll type it out here, and you can see it at the bottom left of this presentation too. Twitter.com/codingwithmanny. Coding apparently, and that's my Twitter. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me. I'm trying to do some TikTok. You can find my username there. You can find me on Stack Overflow. You can find me also on Discord as Coding with Manny. Questions, RPCs, contracts, like even if they're, oh, here we go, totally out of scope of this presentation, but can you please explain the Turing model of the Ethereum? Okay, the Turing model of the Ethereum blockchain. Do you mean like Turing complete? Is that more what you're getting at? So I believe like in the yellow paper, if you guys aren't unfamiliar, the yellow paper is actually there's two papers that were released for Ethereum. There's a white paper that was released by Vitalik. It's a document that really does an overview of what Ethereum is in terms of a blockchain from a very high level point of view. So if you want to get a basic understanding, just Google Ethereum white paper as to start. In the yellow paper, this is like the more mathematical side of things. So if you wanted to dive in deeper, then it's really like, okay, I'm going to dive into the actual mathematics of what and the cryptography that makes up Ethereum. Then this is like that place that you go into, but it's heavy math in that sense. Turing complete, it actually refers to what's his name, the professor or whatnot, Turing, who actually is like one of the birth persons of computing science. There's actually also a test that's named after him, the Turing test. So an AI side of things, the Turing test actually refers to somebody who's like, you create a program that would actually convince somebody that they're a human, that this is a person. But Turing complete in this sense, as I remember it, it's like thinking of something that can do conditional statements, can store data, and can be endless in terms of the type of commands it can make. So in this sense, like most programming languages are Turing complete because they are able to do exactly that. They meet that criteria of, hey, I have an infinite amount of memory. I'm able to do if-else statements, to be able to conditional statements to go to different parts. And it actually came from, if I remember correctly, the idea that programming languages were actually on a tape. So when you would actually program it, you could actually go, if you had like a long tape and it was like 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, etc. And imagine you're reading this code and you're like, hey, in this piece of code, it says now go to line 36, and it would jump the tape forward and jump the tape back. So the idea that it's infinite in terms of data going back and forth, which most programming languages allow for, given how you kind of create any type of variables. And then the idea of like conditional statements of being able to go or put in conditions to be able to go to specific places when it comes to the code as well. Technically though, most applications are not Turing complete because memory is actually finite if we think about it, because the amount of RAM we have is actually finite. So technically most things aren't technically Turing complete, but we consider them Turing complete because we almost consider that the memory could be infinite, because we could use, we could add more RAM on top of, we could use like your hard drive space, etc. But that hopefully kind of answers your question for what is Turing complete and how that relates to Ethereum, because Ethereum is a Turing complete, it has Solidity, which is a Turing complete language. Any more questions? Any questions at all? Feel free. All right. I will, hands up. You're free to unmic and ask your question.
Hi, Mani. Thanks for this session. It's a nice one. So my question is directly to you. I wanted to be sure if I heard you from the beginning correctly, that you said you have 14 years of experience. Did I get that? Did I?
Correct.
Yeah, you said 14. Wow.
Yes. So thank you very much for telling everybody how old I am.
Oh, no.
But yes, for reiterating how old I am. But yes, I've been in tech for about 14 years or so. More on the Web2 side of things, but I've also been on the web side of things. But in total, I've been about 14 years in the tech industry.
That's inspiring. That's actually inspiring for me. All right, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Well, I'll give it a couple more minutes, just open the floor. Again, if you guys are timid, type it up. Again, you can ask any question, maybe what's my favorite color? What do I like tweeting about? I also write from time to time. You can check out my Medium articles as well. You can ask me questions about Developer DAO, which is a DAO that I'm also part of. Any questions at all, feel free. Yes, for the entire presentation, we're talking about, the learning resources. Yes. Okay, so let's just go here quickly. I'll send these links here just so that you, so Build Space is one of them. Encode Club is another. There is academy.developerdao. I'm pasting them here, but you can also Google them as well if you want this presentation. University. And the last one is Crypto Zombies. Can I tell you about Developer? Oh, yes. How much time do you guys have? Because I could tell you about Developer DAO. I can tell you about the history of it. I can tell you. So briefly, if you guys are familiar with decentralized autonomous organizations or DAOs, it's really like a group, like a community. And if you want to check out Developer DAO, I definitely recommend checking out developerdao.com. So the difference between Developer DAO and most other DAOs as well is that there's some DAOs that require access, and Developer DAO is not that different either. In order to be a member of Developer DAO, you actually had bought an NFT, which was free. You only had to pay gas for. There was 9,000 of them or so. It was actually started by a person called Nader David. Nader is also a developer relations engineer or DevRel for another company called Celestial at the moment, and he started this as an experiment about a year ago. It's actually been a year now, and you need an NFT to kind of gain access to it. The community was about like 5,000 members at the time when the NFT was. So in order to access the Discord, you needed the NFT. Now, since season 1 started for Developer DAO actually has released its own token, which is called Code. So Code token, you need about 400 Code token to be able to access Developer DAO. And you can buy that actually on the open market in terms of Uniswap or some other exchanges. And basically, when you get those tokens, that allows you access to Developer DAO and also some voting rights with Developer DAO. The other thing that Developer DAO is doing is that they actually have scholarships too that you can apply to. It's quite competitive. And there's also bounties that are trying to put it in place where if you do a specific bounty, you can actually claim a specific amount of Code token, which will get you a little bit closer to getting entrance. Sometimes myself, I've had the opportunity of like pooling some Code tokens with some other people and giving them to people in terms of gifting them. I wish I could do that all the time, but I don't have, like, I'm not rich because Code token actually, it does cost money to be able to kind of get into it. But what I will say about Developer DAO, which was great, is that it's a vibrant community. You don't have to be a developer to be part of Developer DAO. We have like people who are like wellness instructors and like yoga instructors to like dentists to like people in business development to a wide variety of people. So it's actually grown larger than 5,000 people now because of the tokens that have just opened up the gates in that sense. We have different guilds within Developer DAO. There's like marketing and biz dev. There is developer relations specifically for Developer DAO. There's an education platform for Developer DAO. There is the developers guild in Developer DAO. There's like a ton of other guilds within Developer DAO that I recommend. I personally like to go to some of the voice chats to be able to kind of interact with people and get to know people. What's interesting too, there's also a governance guild specifically around tokenomics and how that applies to everybody. My last few jobs and even doing business development was actually through Developer DAO, which was great. The connections that I've met, people that I've got to know through the industry. If not just Developer DAO, I would recommend, if you guys are not part of a DAO, I definitely recommend jumping into a DAO to be able to kind of be part of community. I just got off a call just before this call. I was meeting people. I'm like, hey, is anybody here part of a DAO? And some of them were like, no. And I'm like, what are you doing? You're in Web3. You should jump into a DAO. There's like some great communities that exist there. And if that community doesn't work for you, there's definitely going to be another community that does work for you. And you get to meet a lot of different people in the space. And usually it's been very positive and very supportive for most DAOs that I've been part of, to be able to understand things or getting the support or sometimes even finding a job, which is great. So that's my small spiel about Developer DAO. Any questions for me? By the way, guys, just to let you know, my favorite color is navy blue. That's my favorite color. If anybody wants to know, it's the most important question of this talk. Yes, Elizabeth.
All right, Manny, thank you for the class. So for someone like me, I'm completely new to Web3. And all these terms, DAO and the likes are really new to me. So what community do you think is best for someone who is just venturing into the Web3 space? That would really, because I was on Discord, and these conversations sometimes you just get lost because all what they're saying I don't understand. So I just had to exit the Discord channel, and I wasn't getting anything from the community with the hackathons and everything. So which particular community do you think is best for beginners, for people who are just venturing into the Web3 space for DAO?
Got it. So there's a few. To be honest, most DAOs are trying to be as beginner friendly as possible when kind of understand. I think the intimidation that we usually get when joining a Discord is like there's a ton of messages, you don't know where to go, etc. And that's really on the fault for the DAO to kind of set up a proper onboarding process. There is some DAOs that I know that have their own onboarding that says like, hey, you're a new member. Let's get on a call, or let's set there's a certain time during the week to be able to kind of get people on board and get them familiar and say, hey, where do you want to contribute? Do you want to learn things? Do you want to contribute in a certain way? Like, how do you want to participate in this specific DAO, right? So, but I would put almost like, hey, you're on the internet, right? You're with a whole bunch of random people that you may or may not ever see. You never know, right? But you're like, hey, what's the worst that can happen? You're asking a question about, like, could you explain decentralized autonomous organizations to me? Can you explain, the white paper to me, or the yellow paper for that matter? Feel free to ask those questions, right? I'm sure that there's going to be somebody that kind of that answers that. That said, there are some DAOs that I do recommend too. One DAO I would recommend, apart from Developer DAO, is Her DAO. So HER DAO. So it's more focused on women in Web3, obviously. There's also Blue DAO, which is quite good as well. But Her DAO, I've actually met some of the members there that actually participate in a lot of hackathons. There is a girl by the name of Lena. I believe her name is Gigahertz on Twitter, and she is amazing. I've seen her at multiple different conferences, helping people kind of like do hackathons or even participating with them to kind of get them up to speed and really understand how to participate in Web3 in that sense. So Her DAO is definitely another one I would recommend too that's very beginner friendly. Another aspect to think about too is that a lot of these like products from Web3 or these chains, like Polygon for that instance, or even for ENS or all these other services, actually have their own DAOs too. And what's great about them is that they kind of dictate governance in terms of, like where should this product be taken, or like what directions they should go. You could if you're a really finance buff and you're like, oh, well, I want to see how finance meets like Web3, then you might want to go to like something that's a little more finance specific, or DeFi or DEX specific, like decentralized exchanges. That might be your thing. If you're more on the identity side of things, you might want to float towards, ENS, or if you want to, or for that matter, ENS is Ethereum name service, or you might want to float towards Polygon ID, which Polygon has a DAO as well, which is going to be an identity wallet. This is coming out fairly soon, but there's different, depending on what space you are, you might actually want to go to something that you're really, really passionate about, right? There's DAOs even that are specific to agriculture and to helping, you know, the earth kind of with recycling, etc. There's like different DAOs for different, you know, missions that they have specifically, or mandates that they want to put in place. So if you want to understand Web3, you know, a lot of these DAOs that I mentioned, like HerDAO, Developer DAO, Blue DAO, they're great places to start and to learn. And again, like some of the resources I'm posted in this chat are great places, and they themselves have their own Discord communities to be able to answer those questions, right? And if most of them have rules in place that, you know, like there's no discrimination in the sense of like, hey, did I ask a stupid question and somebody's like hounding me? It's meant to be a way that, you know, people can come in and ask those questions and be in a spot where like, hey, I really don't understand. Can you explain it to me? And if they don't, then they probably have a very bad conduct of policy. But most of these DAOs actually, you know, have, or these Discord channel servers have a way for you to signing up and say, hey guys, you have to agree to these terms, these code of contact. And if you don't, then, you know, that's a way for you to kind of bring it up and say, hey, I've been mistreated, or somebody I don't believe is just doing something a little bit sketchy within this DAO. So I'd recommend, like, take the initiative, join one, start talking to people, start somewhere that you're familiar with, and you'll find that you'll learn different things, and you'll kind of grow in terms of that Web3 space. You're very welcome. Any other last minute questions? Last fun fact about me, I speak 4 languages, or maybe 4 languages. I speak English, French, Spanish, and some Turkish. So, and if you are around Europe or the MENA region, or for that matter in Africa, I might see you at a conference from time to time. So feel free to hit me up or say hi. All right, guys, if there's no other questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. Just, you know, at me if you guys have questions too. If you have, what are my hobbies aside from tech? Well, that's a little bit personal. No, no, just joking. I like to, well, apart from traveling. Oh yeah, I didn't tell you anybody where I'm from actually. So I'm Canadian, but I don't live in Canada. I live in Turkey. Yeah, I live in Turkey with my wife in a city called Antalya. We travel in Europe in that sense. But I am Canadian, just based in Turkey. And my hobbies aside from tech are dancing. Obviously, dancing is the most amazing thing ever. Also creating content. My wife does a lot of social media content, so I help her out with filming, etc. I love films, like filming and the audio aspect of it, the production side of things. So there's a lot of different things that I love with that too. So those are some side hobbies, apart from learning languages. What are some simple projects a beginner can build to get an understanding of blockchain? Got it. So the most simple project you could build, which is going to sound very cliche, is a Hello World application. There is, I'll post in this chat actually, there's one article that I keep going back to, which I find great for just like understanding basics of a beginner's guide of blockchain. I just need to find the URL. I wish I had it on, but it's by somebody by the name of Nader Dabbit on dev.to. I'll post some of his resources as well. But he has an article that I usually go back to, which is quite great, of understanding like the basics of, you know, wallet interactions, deploying a contract, everything you need to know to be able to kind of like, it's like something full stack. Like that, Ethereum. It's this one. I believe it's this one. But it's a great tutorial as well. Follow it step by step. You won't be disappointed in terms of really understanding how to just deploy a contract, how to interact with the blockchain, and really kind of it gets you around the different mentality. Like one mentality of that changes with that really changed for me when moving from Web 2 to Web 3 is the idea that like when you deploy an application to the blockchain, it's no longer just your application. It's like it's everybody's application. So that's one thing that you have to wrap your head around. It's like, hey, when I deploy something, I have to really like think about, how are people going to interact with it, right? What kind of developer am I? So I'm a full stack web developer in that sense. That's been my profession. I've also been a tech lead. So full stack includes, front end, back end. I've also done some DevOps as well. I wouldn't say that I'm like a heavy DevOps, but I do enjoy creating my own Docker containers and deploying them and coming up with CI/CD processes for that matter. Or pipelines for that matter. I really do like that as well. But very strong on the front end. So if you did a React application, I've done many different types of React applications. From single page applications to server-side rendered applications to server-side generated applications to ISR. And for large companies, like really big companies for that matter, I've also been the back end to be able to build out APIs, built out services that kind of connect to existing computational servers for that matter. So on the back end, I'm quite familiar with also GraphQL or REST. In this sense, one thing I'm learning right now is actually TRPC, which is another means to be able to interact with the backend. So yeah, I wouldn't say I'm like a heavy database person, but I do a lot of database architecture as well in terms of schemas, basics for be able to kind of build out applications. I consider myself like an intermediate because there are some people that are like an enterprise that know heavy database commands, etc. But I know enough to be able to build out applications. Do I have a portfolio website? I do not actually, on purpose. I think GitHub is your portfolio for me as a developer, especially if you're doing a lot of back-end work too. It's really hard to kind of demo existing clients' work. So I just tell people to go to my GitHub account and they'll see, what I've contributed to and what I've built as a way to be able to better understand my skill level. Is it true that it's really difficult for a beginner to get an internship role at a Web3 space? I will say yes and no. Okay, so yes, if you're doing it from the traditional, okay, so this is where Web 2 and Web 3 really differs in terms of the working space. I was applying to FANG, Facebook or Apple or like Netflix or Microsoft for that matter. You would go the traditional route of hey, I'm going to add somebody on LinkedIn, or hey, I get a referral, and I go through an interview process, and that interview process might last 2 months. Sometimes interview processes last 6 months, which is crazy through some of those public companies, right? So the actual process is quite long in terms of their internships too. In terms of vetting them are quite long too. Where I find a little bit different with the Web3 space is that which is great, is that you meet people in DAOs, for instance, and somebody's saying hey, I'm having this problem with the Solidity contract, and I don't know how to do this, right? And people just jump in and be like, hey, have you tried this? Or oh, I saw this, and maybe you might be able to try this or XYZ to be able to solve your issues. What I find interesting in this space is that the willingness that people show within this space is a way to be able to say, hey, I should hire you to be in Web3. So for I've met also a lot of other Web3 companies have hired people that are not super technical, but they found that there was hey, what you did for me was super beneficial. And if you can do that on a full-time aspect or even an internship aspect, because you've given me value, and I've seen that you've given me value, then it's very easy for me to pull you in. And if you understand the space a little bit, you're already ahead of most people. You're even ahead of most Web2 people in the sense of being able to understand, the job and the requirements involved with that. So I think that's a little bit different. You still, for some jobs, you still go through the procedure in Web3 of, hey, let me go through this interview process. I still go through interview processes, but where it came from is those connections and the networking and helping people and giving them value. And then you find that, oh, Manny, he helped me with this, and I see that he's active, and and that really goes a long way of just giving people value and helping them out. Next question is, will the new Ethereum merge affect contract development? So it will be faster. So that's a benefit. One of the things that came out of it is that, you know, like every new block is actually on a because it's proof of stake as a proof of work. It's actually set up in a way that, you know, a block is I think a new block is created every 6 seconds, so it's actually on a finite, like a specific interval. So, and it's able to handle, you don't even require any computational power in that sense. But in general, like in terms of contract development, you'll deploy something, it won't change a thing in terms of it. It'll be a little bit faster, it might be a little bit cheaper, but as far as it goes, like the merge is just like, hey guys, you know, contracts are getting deployed. The only thing that might affect is like the cost for transactions, where if you relate them to USDC, or like if you relate them to the US dollar, like what the cost per transactions are, that's where things might be affected, and they're ideally going to be cheaper. There is something that Polygon is also working on called zkAVM, which is like zero knowledge Ethereum virtual machine, or like ZK rollups is the idea, or the idea of technology, which is like it's what we call is like an L2 solution, right? Ethereum is like L1, like you know, Solana is an L1, I believe, as well. There's a few services like chains that are L1s, and the issue with L1s, like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, is that, you know, there's a limit in terms of size, and there's a limit of how many transactions we can process per second or a given time. L2s or layer 2s are solutions to that, to kind of scale those and natively use some like specific parts of L1s, their technology natively, to kind of scale those solutions. And one of the solutions that Polygon is actually working on, their team, is called zkAVM. And that, with the merge, will actually increase the number of transactions that exponentially, but also introduces this idea of like almost privacy, and this idea of proofs. I won't go into too many details, but I do recommend looking into zero knowledge. Read a little on the zkAVM on the Polygon page on LinkedIn, or just the Polygon technology website. Or check out even some of the talks. It can get really, really complicated. It depends on how much patience you have with it, but it's really, I believe personally, and there's a few other engineering teams that really, really believe that this is like the future of what is going to happen for Ethereum, what the next step is as well, on rollups specifically. I love that this is like turned into just this whole different tangent of like away from blind, but I love it. If you guys have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them too. You are very, very welcome. Guys, I will end it there. But I will say, if you do have any questions for me, if you want to follow up, follow me on Twitter, you know, like just at me personally, just like, hey, yo, Manny, I have this question or whatnot. Like, I'll definitely follow up. Follow me on Twitter, on Instagram, on, again, Twitter, I'm probably more active. Follow me on GitHub, you know, on Stack Overflow. Like, you'll see my name, Coding with Manny, in different places. If you have questions about developer DAO, if you have questions about programming, anything that has to do with that, high level, very specific, let me know, and I'll try to find the answers for you, or I'll even write tutorials. That's something I usually do as well. So thank you, guys. Thank you very much. And I will hope to see you in Twitter. All right, guys. Take it easy. Ciao.